Today we want to finish our presentation, our discussion of the new Keynesian model, and we really just have one goal to try to accomplish, and that is show how to kind of modify our new Keynesian model of the transmission mechanism to account for something that we've seen in the past two recessions, and that is the fact that the policy rate set by the Fed cannot really go below zero, okay? During the financial crisis and the most recent pandemic-related recession, the Federal Reserve lowered its target for the effective federal funds rate essentially as low as it can go, between 0 and 25 basis points. Although I think it's clear just by looking at the actual data that the Fed probably would have liked to have lowered the interest rate even more if it could have, okay? So this zero lower bound on the interest rate is something that we're going to need to account for in our model. So that's the first thing we're going to accomplish today is show how to modify the model to pick that feature of the data up. But then I guess more importantly is what we want to do is examine the implications of the zero lower bound in the model. Are there any undesirable features of the zero lower bound that might cause the economy to become more unstable? All right. Okay. So let's start by thinking about how we're actually going to incorporate the zero bound in our simple three-equation new Keynesian model. The basic model implies that policy is set according to an interest rate rule, a very simple interest rate rule, right? One that is a small kind of modification or simplification of the Taylor rule that we've spent some time talking about, right? The Taylor rule allows the Fed's policy rate, the federal funds rate, to respond systematically to changes in inflation from target and also changes in the output gap. The mathematical policy rule that we've incorporated into our model, however, is easier in the sense that we're ignoring those output gap terms and we're just really focusing on deviations of inflation from target. So that's the policy rule that we have used thus far, okay? And what does that policy rule say? That the central bank is going to raise its nominal interest rate if inflation exceeds target. If inflation goes 1 percentage point above the target level of inflation, the Taylor rule suggests that the nominal interest rate will be pulled up by beta pi %, okay? If, on the other hand, inflation falls below target, the Taylor rule calls for policy to be accommodative. That is, for the interest rate to fall by beta pi %, okay? That much is clear. Now let me ask you this. What if the Taylor rule here calls for the central bank to set the policy rate to a negative value? So let's suppose that inflation falls below target inflation enough such that the amount by which the central bank has to lower the nominal interest rate according to its rule is going to require the interest rate to go from a positive value to some negative value, say negative 0.5% or negative 1%, okay? What happens in that scenario? Well, we already know from experience that the zero lower bound prevents this from happening in practice. But yet, in our theoretical model, we haven't ruled that out as a possibility. We've simply assumed that the policy rate can be adjusted either positively or negatively in response to inflation gap movements, okay? This suggests then that there may be a flaw or something that is being left out of our new Keynesian model, all right? In particular, we haven't imposed any constraint on the policy equation, the Taylor rule, that would prevent the nominal interest rate from actually going below zero, all right? Because we know that this can't happen in the real world, that this can't happen in practice. So what we need to think about doing today is figuring out how to modify this equation to account for the possibility that this zero bound is going to be encountered from time to time. How can we modify this simple three-equation model to account or accommodate the zero lower bound? The fact that the Fed would like to lower the interest rate below zero, but sometimes it can't do that. But it actually can't do that ever. But sometimes it's going to hit that zero lower bound, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, so let's go about that task first. Let's use this monetary policy equation, that is the Taylor rule, to try to identify precisely those times when the central bank would like to set the interest rate to a negative value, but it can't due to the zero lower bound. In other words, what I want to do is figure out exactly how far inflation has to fall below target inflation in order to trigger the zero lower bound. Okay, that's what I want to think about here. Okay. So how far then must inflation fall below target inflation before this policy rule becomes invalid, in the sense that it's prescribing a negative interest rate, but the Fed can't lower the interest rate below zero? How do we figure out what that kind of threshold level of inflation is? Well, it's pretty straightforward, right? What the Taylor rule here does is it recommends an interest rate setting according to this particular formula. So imagine what would happen then if the formula, that is the right-hand side of the equation, was such that whatever number it spits out for the interest rate ends up being less than or equal to zero, okay? Well, we can solve this inequality for the level of inflation then that would actually trigger this zero lower bound, right? So beta pi times the inflation gap is just equal to the negative of the inflation target minus this natural or equilibrium real interest rate. If we divide both sides by the coefficient beta pi, and then also take this inflation target term over to the right-hand side, we get the following expression: that the level of inflation that is low enough to trigger hitting the zero lower bound would be equal to beta pi minus 1 over beta pi times the inflation target minus 1 over beta pi times this equilibrium real interest rate. I'm going to call that term, whatever it is, pi zero. So when we look at this graphically on the next slide, this term pi zero, I want you guys to remember that this is the kind of the threshold amount of inflation below target inflation, such that the zero lower bound is going to be encountered by the central bank. If inflation actually falls below this critical value, pi zero, or this threshold level, then instead of this interest rate being set equal to the Taylor rule, what the central bank has to do here is just set the interest rate equal to zero. It doesn't really have a choice, right? This suggests then the following policy equation for our new Keynesian model: that the interest rate I is going to be equal to either what the Taylor rule prescribes, that is R star plus target inflation plus beta pi times the inflation gap, or zero, whichever one is bigger. Make sense? If the Taylor rule prescribes a positive interest rate, then the central bank will implement the Taylor rule. However, if the Taylor rule prescribes a negative interest rate, the interest rate is simply going to be set equal to zero. So it's the maximum of the Taylor rule or zero, whichever of those two elements happens to be larger. Okay, let me just briefly comment on the three features of the model that determine whether or not the zero lower bound is going to be encountered, or the frequency, I should say, with which the zero bound is going to be hit. Okay, that is, This threshold level of inflation depends on, you can see from the inequality, it depends on three things, right? It depends on the target level of inflation. It depends on the equilibrium or natural real interest rate. And it depends on beta pi, that is the strength in which the policymaker responds to inflation. Okay, let's take the inflation target first. What do you see happens here? Let's say the Fed were to raise its inflation target from 2% to 3%. This has been in the policy discussion recently, by the way. There are lots of policymakers that think we should raise the inflation target. What does that do to pi zero then? If the Fed were to raise its inflation target, is it going to raise pi zero or lower it? It's going to raise it because beta pi is bigger than 1. In other words, the level of inflation that will trigger the zero lower bound is going to be higher if the Fed raises the inflation target. So if the Fed raises the inflation target, then what might actually happen is that in some situations, it could be easier to hit the zero lower bound with more frequency, okay? What about R star? So I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but John Taylor originally proposed that the equilibrium real interest rate was around 2%. One of the things that Federal Reserve officials and the economists who work for the Fed have recognized in recent years is that our estimate of R star is probably too high. That in recent years, that the equilibrium real interest rate has probably gone down because of this kind of global savings glut, everyone from the world trying to dump their savings into the United States. That's caused real interest rates to decline, okay? What does a declining natural real interest rate do to this threshold level of inflation? If R star went from 2% to, let's say, 1%, what happens to pi zero? Michael, it goes up, right? So, and I think this is one of the major reasons why the zero lower bound has become more problematic for the Fed, is because this natural real interest rate is not really 2% like John Taylor thought in the early 90s. In fact, it has come down, and as it has come down over time, this threshold level of inflation at which the zero bound gets triggered goes up. That means you're going to more frequently hit the zero lower bound on the interest rate during these recessionary periods. And then lastly, we have beta pi. Now this enters the inequality in several places, but hopefully you can see here that when beta pi goes up, this number here gets bigger, and this number here gets smaller, but since it enters with a negative sign, the whole thing gets bigger. So as the interest rate responds more aggressively to inflation, what you're going to find is that that threshold level of inflation goes up, right? And so it's easier to hit the zero lower bound if the Fed responds really aggressively to movements in the inflation gap. Okay. So now let's specify the full 3-equation new Keynesian model that also accounts for the zero lower bound, okay? Now, what is that model going to incorporate? It's going to incorporate the same old IS equation. That doesn't change. The output gap is inversely related to the gap between the real interest rate and this equilibrium real interest rate plus a demand shock. The monetary policy equation is the only thing that really changes. Now, the policy rate is the maximum of the Taylor rule, or zero. The Phillips curve is also unchanged. That just has inflation equaling expected inflation plus this output gap term reflecting firms' marginal costs and a supply shock, okay? So what we want to do now is we want to think about how this new policy equation that accounts for the zero bound modifies our new Keynesian model, all right? It does not affect the Phillips curve. It does not affect the IS equation. It only affects the monetary policy rule, Okay. Now, how do we approach this in the last classes? We have a Phillips curve that graphs inflation against the output gap, and we had an ISMP curve that graphs inflation versus the output gap. One represented the supply side of the economy, the other demand side of the economy. The Phillips curve is the same. What obviously changes here is the nature of the ISMP equation. Okay? Things are a little bit more complicated now because why? We have to consider two cases. One case in which the interest rate follows the Taylor rule, and a second case in which it hits the zero lower bound. Okay? So how do we derive what the ISMP equation looks like? Well, we have to consider both of these cases. Okay? Now, what happens if inflation is above this threshold level of inflation we identified on the last slide, pi 0? That means that the interest rate is going to be positive and set according to the Taylor rule. In that circumstance, what does the ISMP equation look like? We've already done this exercise, right? You just take the Taylor rule and you plug it directly into the IS equation and you do a little math and you get our ISMP equation that we've already analyzed. You get inflation is equal to target inflation minus 1 over beta pi minus 1 times the output gap minus the demand shock. That is exactly the same as before. Literally no different. Unfortunately, there are going to be situations in which inflation falls below this threshold value of inflation at which the zero lower bound on the interest rate is triggered. If those conditions emerge, what does the ISMP schedule look like? Okay, this is actually very easy to do. We simply plug our setting of the interest rate into the IS equation, right? The IS equation would be the output gap is equal to negative I, which is equal to 0 in this case, minus pi minus R star plus the demand shock. So the output gap would simply be inflation plus the natural real interest rate plus the demand shock. So inflation is equal to the output gap minus R star minus U. Or if I want to make this look symmetric to our original ISMP equation, what do we have? That inflation would be equal to the negative of the equilibrium real interest rate plus the gap between the output gap and the demand shock. Okay? Now, there's a couple of key differences between this ISMP schedule and this one. What's one that sticks out to you immediately? Here, inflation will depend on the target rate of inflation, but is independent of the equilibrium real interest rate. When the zero lower bound is hit, however, target inflation doesn't end up anywhere in the equation, but the equilibrium real interest rate does. So that's one difference. But what is really the most important difference? What is the slope of the ISMP equation in both cases? Over here, the slope is negative 1 over beta pi minus 1. In the original ISMP equation, it slopes down, correct? What's the slope of the new ISMP equation when the zero lower bound is confronted? It's positive 1, right? Meaning that the ISMP curve is now going to be upward sloping once the zero lower bound is triggered. What does that sound like to you? That's going to result in a violation of the Taylor principle, right? It's going to resemble what we talked about in the last class. Remember, when beta pi falls less than 1, the Fed is not aggressively responding to inflation. The ISMP schedule starts to slope up. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen over here when the interest rate is pegged at 0. So the bad outcomes that we saw emerge when the Taylor principle is violated, something very similar to that can emerge when we have the zero lower bound. Okay, so let's forget about the math for a minute and try to look at the model graphically. What does this reformulated ISMP schedule imply about our graph of the demand side of the economy? Okay. Now, again, I'm trying to show you as many equations here so that you guys don't have to have to constantly flip back. But this is what our ISMP schedule looks like now, right? It's a piecemeal function, right? Inflation is equal to the original ISMP schedule if inflation is above the threshold that triggers the zero bound, or it's equal to this new one if the zero lower bound is hit, okay? All right. So if inflation is above pi zero, then what does the ISMP schedule look like? Exactly like what we saw before. It has a negative slope where the slope is -1 divided by beta pi minus 1. So this is exactly the same as what we saw in the previous classes, okay? And so for example, if the output gap were equal to 0, right? And there were no demand shocks, so U is equal to 0, and target inflation, let's say, is equal to pi 1, then according to our ISMP schedule, inflation would also be equal to pi 1. Exactly the same as before. And again, let me just to emphasize this, why does the ISMP schedule have a negative slope? Think about this. As inflation rises, the central bank will increase the nominal policy rate by more than the increase in inflation. Correct? And so what happens to the real interest rate then? The real interest rate goes up, and in the IS equation, if the real interest rate goes up, the output gap goes down. So that's why we have the negatively sloped ISMP equation. Okay, but what happens? Sorry, so this is what I just said. Inflation up, the nominal rate goes up, therefore the real rate goes up, therefore the output gap goes down. I meant to present that. What happens, however, if inflation falls below this threshold level at which the zero bound is triggered? Then the ISMP equation looks like this, right? It has a positive slope, right? So think about what's going to happen here. If inflation rises and the interest rate is stuck at 0, the nominal rate is stuck at 0, then what happens to the real interest rate? As inflation goes up, if the nominal rate does not respond, that means the real interest rate is going to decline. And if the real interest rate declines, what happens to the output gap? The output gap has to go up through the IS equation. So the ISMP schedule is going to have a positive slope. You guys see what's going on here? That once inflation gets to this threshold value, pi 0, the ISMP schedule is going to not continue its downward slope, it's going to bend back sharply. It's going to be what we call a kinked ISMP curve. And it will go from having a negative slope to having a positive slope equal to 1 exactly once this inflation rate hits the threshold at which the zero lower bound is triggered. This is essentially what happens to the ISMP curve if we want to account for the zero bound. It's no longer downward sloping everywhere. It's only going to be downward sloping up until the point at which the policy rate hits 0. And then it's going to have a positive slope. Unfortunately, that positive slope can create some real headaches for macroeconomic stabilization policy. Okay, the basic idea here, let me again reemphasize this, is that the zero lower bound is preventing the real interest rate from responding positively to an increase in inflation. As inflation goes up, if the nominal rate is stuck at 0, then that means the real interest rate is going to go down instead of up. And as the real interest rate goes down, that's going to drive the output gap higher, which will end up driving inflation higher also through the Phillips curve, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. And so there's going to be a positively sloped ISMP curve when the 0 lower bound is binding. Okay, you guys have any questions about that so far? All right. The question I want to ask you now is, does the 0 lower bound have any actual, let's say, practical relevance when we want to analyze the equilibrium situation in the new Keynesian model? How do we do that? Well, let's add to our ISMP schedule here the Phillips curve, okay? If we want to think about what happens in equilibrium, what do we need to do? We need to look at the intersection of the ISMP schedule and the Phillips curve, right? All right. Under what conditions do you think the 0 lower bound is not going to have any influence on the economy here or on the equilibrium in the model? If the Phillips curve ends up intersecting the ISMP curve on its downward sloping portion. Okay? So for instance, let's say this is our Phillips curve and the output gap is currently 0. There are no demand shocks. There are also no supply shocks. Target inflation and expected inflation are both equal to pi 1. And so the equilibrium rate of inflation is also pi 1, which is above the 0 lower bound threshold. If this is the world that we're living in, where the Phillips curve intersects the ISMP schedule on its downward sloping portion, then the 0 lower bound is not going to have any relevance for the equilibrium, right? It's not going to affect outcomes. Right? Here, the output gap is 0 and inflation is just equal to pi 1. Now, let me warn you, these graphs start to get very complicated, okay? Well, I shouldn't say complicated. A lot is on them, so you want to make sure you're referencing each of these curves properly and showing what target inflation, expected inflation, and the various shocks are equal to, okay? Under what conditions, however, might the 0 lower bound affect the equilibrium? So let's say we start here at point 1. In order for the 0 lower bound to have an impact on the equilibrium, what must happen? The Phillips curve must intersect the ISMP schedule, not on the downward sloping portion, but on its upward sloping portion. I can think of a couple of ways in which that might happen here. What's one way? Levi? One way would be if there is a right shift in the Phillips curve or a downward shift in the Phillips curve that was sufficient to cause the intersection point to be down here on the upward sloping portion of the ISMP curve. But another possibility, Levi, is a left shift in the ISMP schedule. Let's say a negative demand shock that shifts the whole curve over here to the left enough to cause the intersection point to be on the upward sloping portion. That's what I want to talk about for the rest of class today is these examples that in which the 0 lower bound can be affected, and then give you guys a chance to do a couple of examples on your own. Okay, let's consider the effects. Here's what I want you guys to think about. Let's consider first the effects of a really large negative demand shock, kind of like the big demand shock we saw that precipitated the great financial crisis. We can think about the Great Recession as being the result of this large negative demand shock, okay? What is going to happen then graphically if let's say the value of U in our model goes to some big negative value? So that's what this double inequality sign means. So U is just a rather large negative demand shock. How does that look graphically? Well, the ISMP schedule is going to shift to the left, okay? Now, let's think about this one thing at a time. If one were to completely disregard the presence of the zero lower bound, then what would happen in equilibrium? The ISMP curve would shift to the left like so, right? And we would go from 0.1 would be our initial equilibrium to now 0.2, where the Phillips curve intersects the new ISMP schedule. Now be careful here. This is an ISMP schedule for where target inflation is still equal to pi 1, but the demand shock is just some negative number, okay? Now, you'll notice, and again, this is somewhat of a review, or it is a review, that the change in inflation from 0.1 to 0.2 and the change in the output gap is not as large as the shock itself, right? The curve shifts by this distance, right? But the output gap doesn't fall by as much. The ISMP curve shifts down by this distance, but inflation doesn't actually fall by that much in equilibrium. What's happening here is the output gap and inflation are being partially stabilized against the effect of the demand shock. Why is that? As inflation falls, as the output gap falls, the central bank responds by lowering the nominal interest rate. It lowers the nominal interest rate enough to actually lower the real interest rate. Lowering the real interest rate helps boost the output gap in the IS equation, so the output gap doesn't fall by as much as the shock. And as the output gap rises a little bit because of that monetary policy accommodation, that causes inflation to go up a little bit in the Phillips curve. So inflation does not fall by the full effect of the shock. That's what happens if we completely ignore the presence of the zero lower bound. But what happens if, in the course of this shock, inflation falls below that pi zero threshold, like it does here graphically? Well, the central bank tries to lower the nominal interest rate, right? Unfortunately, it hits the zero lower bound before it's able to actually lower the real interest rate. And so the real interest rate rises. And if the real interest rate rises, what happens to the output gap? The output gap goes down even more. And if the output gap goes down, what happens to inflation? It goes down even more in the Phillips curve. So the zero lower bound, instead of stabilizing conditions, is actually causing the shocks to be amplified in the economy, right? So what's going to happen here if the zero lower, if we actually account for the zero lower bound? The ISMP curve looks like this instead of this, right? Remember, the threshold level of inflation doesn't change, and so the whole thing shifts to the left by the size of the shock. And you see now that what happens is the new ISMP schedule is intersecting the same old Phillips curve at a point that is on its upward sloping portion. And as a result of that, instead of the output gap falling from 0.1 to 2, it falls all the way down here to 0.3. Instead of inflation falling from pi 1 to 0.2, it falls all the way down to 0.3, which is actually a negative value, it looks like, on my graph. So again, I know I keep repeating this, but I want to make sure you guys understand the mechanics of what's going on here. Why is the instability in the output gap and inflation exacerbated or amplified by the zero lower bound? There's no stabilization going on. You see here that the fall in the output gap is bigger than the size of the shift, that is the shock. The fall in inflation is also larger than the size of the shock or the shift in the ISMP curve. Why is that? It's because monetary policy is inadvertently fueling the flames of this demand shock, right? By not being able to lower the interest rate low enough. Again, what happens here is that the demand shock puts downward pressure on the output gap. It sends output way below potential. Through the Phillips curve, that sends inflation below target inflation. The Fed would like to respond to that by lowering the nominal interest rate enough to actually lower the real interest rate. It can't do that, however, because it hits the zero lower bound on the nominal rate. And so the real interest rate ends up rising, which causes the output gap to fall by even more, and therefore causes inflation to fall by even more through the Phillips curve. So the zero lower bound creates more instability in the output gap and inflation after a negative demand shock. After a negative demand shock that's sufficiently large, right? If it were a very small demand shock, you could imagine this curve only shifting in a little bit, and we'd still be on the the downward sloping portion of the IS&P curve. The Great Recession was a significant negative shock, which probably caused this thing to shift in enough to where the Phillips curve intersected the IS&P curve on its upward sloping portion. Okay, so let's continue on this example. Let's say we're at point 3, where we've experienced this big negative demand shock, okay? We've all witnessed what's happened here, and we've seen that because the Fed, or the central bank, has been unable to stimulate the economy in the traditional way, that prices and inflation have fallen by a considerable amount. What happens if the private sector, if households and investors suddenly expect inflation to be lower as a result of the zero lower bound? That is, we revise our inflation expectations down. What's going to happen to the Phillips curve? The Phillips curve is going to shift down, right? And the new equilibrium point might even be worse. We would move from point 3 to point 4. Now again, why is that happening? If we revise down our inflation expectations, that causes actual inflation to fall, right? It shifts inflation down by this much. As inflation falls, what would we like to do? We would like to try to stimulate economic activity to try to raise inflation. But that requires lowering the nominal interest rate, which we can't do because we're at the zero lower bound. So if the interest rate is at 0 and inflation goes even lower, what happens to the real interest rate? It goes even higher, which causes the output gap to fall by even more, from point 3 to point 4, and therefore causes inflation to fall by even more, from this point down to this point, right? So what we have here is a situation where this large negative demand shock can cause us to trigger the zero lower bound, which then might cause us to revise our expectations of inflation even lower. And that sets in motion this kind of death spiral where inflation is falling and the output gap is falling. So we're experiencing a significant recession. And it leads to what some economists have described this situation as, it's known as a liquidity trap, a position in which the nominal interest rate is set equal to 0, and the economy falls into this kind of deflationary, recessionary spiral. It's called a liquidity trap because when the nominal interest rate is 0, then bonds and money become more or less perfect substitutes, right? What is the nominal return to money? 0. What's the nominal return to government bonds? I, the interest rate. Well, when the interest rate hits 0, then money and bonds are more or less perfect substitutes. And so people can get rid of all their bonds and simply put them in money. And so there's this, what's called a liquidity trap situation, okay? That's how we describe this liquidity trap situation in the new Keynesian model. It's where we get to this point where there's just kind of this downward spiral of inflation and the output gap because the equilibrium point is occurring on this upward sloping portion of the ISMP schedule, where the zero lower bound is binding. Hopefully you guys will notice here that once the zero lower bound is triggered, inflation dynamics kind of behave like the Taylor principle is being violated. Remember in the last class what we showed you. If the ISMP schedule is upward sloping and there was an increase in expected inflation, that causes actual inflation to go up by even more and creates this kind of unstable inflationary feedback loop, which helped us explain, by the way, what we saw during the 1970s, where the real interest rate was becoming negative, but inflation was rising quickly. This is the exact opposite situation, right? Where the real interest rate is rising because as inflation is falling, the Fed isn't able to lower the nominal interest rate, right? And so it's creating inflation instability just in the opposite direction, but really for the same reason. It's because the Taylor principle is being violated here. We have an upward sloping ISMP schedule, and it's because we've hit this zero lower bound and can't do anything else. I alluded to this a little bit in the last class, but this is really precisely the reason why the Fed in the post-crisis environment came up with all of these new fancy, unconventional monetary policy tools, is because it no longer had the ability to try to stimulate the economy through reductions in the federal funds rate. It began quantitative easing, these large-scale asset purchases. It also announced these things called forward guidance measures, which were projections about where the interest rate would go in the future, as ways of trying to stimulate the economy that didn't require further reductions in the federal funds rate. So it's this zero lower bound which really provided the rationale for why the Fed had to resort to these unconventional policy measures. Okay, you guys have any questions about that? So we've accomplished two things today. We've discovered how to modify or augment the new Keynesian model to account for the zero lower bound. And we've discussed the implications of the zero lower bound in the model. We've seen in particular how negative demand shock and reductions in people's inflation expectations can lead to these highly suboptimal outcomes where inflation and the output gap are kind of spiraling out of control into a liquidity trap situation. Let me give you guys some opportunities here to continue to practice this. And so in this solved problem, let me just be clear about where we're picking up here. And I think in the slides that I've given you guys, I've also presented this graph. Let's assume that we're starting here at 0.4, okay? So we can think of this as the post-Great Recession world, where we've been hit with this horrible negative demand shock. People have revised their expectations down. And this is the point in the business cycle that we're at, okay? This practice problem asks you to think about a couple of ways that policy might help us escape this liquidity trap situation. So let's suppose that the economy is kind of stuck in this liquidity trap, resulting from the inability of monetary policy to lower its interest rate below the zero bound. Describe and illustrate two ways the economy might be able to escape the liquidity trap situation. And again, what I mean by that, is there any way that we can somehow get to an equilibrium point where the ISMP schedule is intersecting the Phillips curve on its downward sloping portion? That's how we escape the liquidity trap. You guys have any thoughts about that? What could possibly be done? How about fiscal policy? What happened in the aftermath of the great financial crisis? Congress got together in their haphazard way and passed something called the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. It was a roughly $1 trillion stimulus package to try to rescue the economy, to stimulate it and drag the economy out of the recession. How can we think about or model fiscal policy in our new Keynesian apparatus? A big demand shock. So one way to think about policy here, whether it's a big increase in government spending or a big reduction in taxes, is that it might increase a way to increase aggregate demand that's not affected by interest rate changes from monetary policy. Okay? Well, look what happens here. If the demand shock is big enough, then what's going to happen to the ISMP curve? Exactly the opposite of what we showed on the couple slides ago. The ISMP curve is going to shift way out to the right. Okay? If this is a $1 trillion American Recovery and Reinvestment Act policy that cuts taxes enough and increases government spending enough to raise output above potential, it could potentially shift the ISMP curve way out here to the right. At which point, what would happen? The new equilibrium point would be at the intersection of the Phillips curve and the ISMP schedule. Okay? Now again, make sure you guys are labeling all of this right. Okay? Here was the ISMP schedule that we were starting from, one in which target inflation is pi 1, but there was this huge negative demand shock. Now there is a huge positive supply shock coming from fiscal policy, but target inflation is still equal to pi 1. That shifts the ISMP schedule to the right, and the new equilibrium occurs here at a slightly positive output gap, it looks like, and higher inflation. Where, again, in the Phillips curve, expected inflation is a little bit under pi 1. So that's one way to escape the liquidity trap. Others. What if the Fed took measures to try to raise inflation expectations directly? That what if the central bank came out with some policy announcement that led investors and households to believe that inflation was going to be higher in the future? Then what happens to expected inflation? Expected inflation goes up, and so therefore what should happen to the Phillips curve? The Phillips curve should shift up. If the Fed can convince the private sector that it's going to take certain measures like quantitative easing in order to raise prices in the economy, that could shift the Phillips curve up enough in order for the intersection point to be on the downward sloping portion of the ISMP schedule. And we would be able to escape the liquidity trap situation. I think this is a very good description of what the Fed did after the financial crisis through its unconventional policy measures, right? It announced all of these huge asset purchases to expand the size of its balance sheet. The hope was that it was going to loosen credit conditions enough to try to stimulate the economy to get prices moving in the upward direction, thereby increasing inflation expectations to shift the Phillips curve up. Forward guidance, you've heard me talk about that several times. Do you guys know what that is exactly? Have I defined that formally in this class? I'm not sure I have. Forward guidance is the practice by the central bank of explaining where the interest rate is going to go in the future. So it's not just that the Fed is saying we're going to set the interest rate equal to 0 for this month, but rather we project the interest rate to be equal to whatever it is over the next several months, quarters, even years. Essentially, the central bank or the Fed is promising to keep interest rates low for an extended period of time into the future. That's what we mean. That's what they mean by forward guidance. The Fed is trying to provide guidance about what the forward interest rates are going to be in our economy. The hope then is that if investors believe that the Fed will be accommodative for an extended period of time, that will help boost output and prices, and therefore shift the Phillips curve up through this inflation expectations channel. All right, so this second example kind of shows how monetary policy responded to the great financial crisis by trying to impact inflation expectations directly. The last example, I think, shows better what fiscal policy Congress actually did to try to help drag the economy out of the recession. So likely what we got out of this was a rightward shift in the ISMP schedule, as well as an upward shift in the Phillips curve to try to blunt the effects of this large negative demand shock and to escape this liquidity trap type of situation. You guys have any questions about that, Levi? You mean a positive value of epsilon, an adverse supply shock? Yeah. The government could they would never do this, but I imagine if you want to think of a supply shock as being like a negative oil shock, let's say, the government could dump a bunch of oil from its strategic reserve and restrict oil imports to try to raise the price of energy artificially. That would certainly move the Phillips curve higher. I think there would be much more market and consumer outrage at that than the normal levers of policy, like fiscal policy and monetary policy. But it's possible. The tariffs, right? Tariffs is a great example of an adverse supply shock. If our government imposes tariffs on imported goods, that raises the price of all goods that we're consuming, and therefore shifts the Phillips curve up. I didn't think about that one, but yeah, tariff policy could be an example of an adverse supply shock. That wasn't done, but in theory, it could potentially work. Anything that is not explicitly part of the model gets lumped into these two shocks, demand and supply shock. The model is highly stylized. It has monopolistically competitive firms that have sticky prices. That's where the pi, the expected pi, and the kappa times the output gap term come from. Anything else that affects the supply side of the economy gets lumped into epsilon. The IS equation shows how the output gap is related inversely to this interest rate gap, right? But anything else that might affect aggregate demand, like fiscal policy or consumer sentiment or Keynes's animal spirits, would get lumped into the demand shock. A more complicated model that features those things in a more realistic way would obviously have many more equations. The new Keynesian model simplifies all that down, and so a lot of that extra stuff gets lumped directly into one of these two shocks. Very good question. Any others? Okay, I know that we've spent a lot of time talking about this model. We've 4 consecutive classes now. And I made a conscious decision to do that because I think that this is maybe the most probably is conceptually the most challenging content of the course, okay? You guys are gonna have a lab on Monday that will have some questions on there, obviously about the new Keynesian model. Some of them are going to be about the open economy stuff, right? Exchange rates and how monetary policy actions to affect its holdings of international reserve affect the monetary base and can therefore affect the exchange rate. And then we also had this section on policy goals and rules. So information about the Fed's dual mandate, differences between rules versus discretion, and how the Fed determines which side of the dual mandate to come down on by evaluating policy according to one of these loss functions, right? So you could join, I'm not going to do this in this class, but how the Fed thinks about these problems is it's got a model of the economy, kind of like our new Keynesian model, and it has a loss function that it uses to evaluate different policies, right? It chooses different settings for the interest rate, and it thinks about what inflation and output gap stability are going to look like in all of those different cases and ranks them according to a loss function. So we did some simple exercises of that a few weeks ago. I will try to put, you know, 4 or 5 problems of all of that kind of thing on your lab to give you guys a practice opportunity to do them before your exam, which is going to be on Wednesday. Again, it's a face-to-face exam, so even though there's only 7 of you here today and only 9 people online, however many other people are actually enrolled in this class need to be here on next Wednesday to take the test. Regarding this new Keynesian model, I'm not likely going to ask you to do anything that would require you to memorize equations. Okay, I think that's a little much. But I think if you practice this stuff a few times, you're going to quickly remember kind of what these equations look like. All right. Mainly what I'm going to ask you to do is analyze an equilibrium situation in the context of the new Keynesian model graphically. So know what the Phillips curve looks like, know what the ISMP schedule looks like. If it is a question where I want you to account for the zero lower bound, I will specifically put it in the problem. If I don't mention the zero lower bound at all, you can basically ignore it, okay? So that will be clear in the context of the problem. All right, you guys have any last questions about this stuff? That's really all I have today. So we can finish early if you want. All right, I'll see you all on Monday for the lab and then Wednesday for the exam.
Thank you.